Welcome, beautiful souls. I'm so excited to have another episode of About Her today with the wonderful Taylor. Taylor, thank you so much for joining. I'm excited to have you here and to talk about anxiety and pressure that we give ourselves and whatever else comes up. But before we start, I would love to have you introduce yourself a bit so that we can, get a feeling for you and your amazing work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Taylor Davis. I'm the founder of Tailored Mind Therapeutics, a mental health private practice, and I work primarily with women that are navigating anxiety and panic disorders. And while we touch on a plethora of psychological disorders, that is my jam and my sweet spot. And so we navigate perfectionism, establishing healthy boundaries, just kind of navigating limiting belief systems and just kind of redefining wellness overall. And I am also super excited to be here and to share this space and to hopefully get into some really important and meaningful conversation.
Yes, I'm sure we will. And I think what you just touched upon, every woman I know, I have worked with, who I'm friends with, has experienced to some point what you just touched upon. So I think it's like a really relevant conversation to have. And at least in Europe where I live, it's not that big of a topic still yet, unfortunately. Because speaking from my own experience, I had such a hard time coming out of the pressure that I felt from the outside, but that I also have given myself when working a corporate job. And it was a long time until it occurred to me to maybe it's not that I'm not working good enough, but it's like that the pressure from the outside is too big, or that there's kind of that there's an adjustment to make without going into judgment. That is not my fault. So I think
Yeah.
we're it's a really, really important area you're covering. And I wonder what's the thing that brings women to you the moment where they say okay, I kind of cannot do that alone. I need to get support.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of times it's exactly what you said. The evaluation piece of, is it me? Is it the external factors? Why am I not performing well? Right. And you see it impact, I think, our emotional wellness, our physical wellness. And so unfortunately, by the time not every time, but by the time people come and see me, they have been met with a ton of emotional distress and defeat, burnout, heightened sense of anxiety and depression. There's a lot of layers there, but I think to your point, right, it's having enough awareness and compassion to recognize I might just be outnumbered with stressors here. I might just be outnumbered with several things in my life. And we're just one variable in trying to make that system work. So we do a lot of just normalizing the feeling of defeat and not winning or performing well. And then hopefully at the end of that process, being able to create separation between our worth and our value and our sense of self from our performance.
Yes. Oh my God. That is definitely something that is needed and needed to be talked about more. The separation of your worth and your performance. I feel it's very interconnected in the way we have been raised, how the collective is still working. It's okay, the more you work, the more successful you are in classical terms, and the more valuable you are, because they somehow seem to be linked. And I feel until we understand, until we come out of that classical worldview of I'm working 15 hours and that is kind of a good thing, regardless of how exhausted I am, how close to burnout I am, how poor my sleep might be at that time. But there's this, I worked until exhaustion. That is kind of a good thing, collectively spoken. And it's really strange because if you talk about it like that, it's definitely something to think about and ask yourself why. But in that moment, normally we are not. I think it's really interesting how we are often so blind to see things that we see from the outside very good, but for ourselves, we're kind of defeating the system that we're in that is not supporting us.
Yeah. I mean, and I think knowing better and then applying better is difficult. We live in a performance-based world. We live in a space where people praise hard work and persistency, and it's difficult. I think there's a point where I've had to unlearn this concept of balance. Something is going to have to be on the back burner. Something's going to have to, be off balance. And it's just more so how you respond to the chaos of it all. It's definitely challenging. I make the joke of like, no one gives you a reward for working over your capacity, right? There isn't a plaque when you've overextended or reached burnout that says, yay, us. But then on the other end of that, the harder you work, the more praise you receive, right? From early on. And to your point, the origin of our childhood and the messages we learn that we apply as law, it's a challenge, I think, to just unlearn that concept that rest doesn't have to be a reward. It can just be a choice and even a sense of resistance sometimes.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? That like, even though we logically know that this kind of amount of work or pressure is not benefiting us, or maybe is even like making us sick, that it's really hard to stop because of the validation, because of like, I feel that there's just this kind of certainty in the way things work, and the unknown is the thing our nervous systems is most scared of. So we'd rather stay in that familiar hell instead of saying like, okay, I need to rest. I need to really get in relaxation time, sleep time, a holiday without needing to kind of fight for it or explain it, just to say like it's necessary and it's nothing that I need to over explain or I need to defend myself for. It's just
Right.
basic human right, or it should be. But the praise you mentioned, I think it's really interesting how close that is linked, and how I know I come from fashion, which is like a very exploitive kind of work environment. And I remember so well how we have all been so proud that we have only slept 2 hours under the sewing machines because everything was so stressful before the next show. And it was kind of like pride that we drew from really putting ourselves to exhaustion. And I think about that often. And I think like maybe not that extreme, but in almost all jobs I ever had or my clients ever told me about, there is some part of this like pushback if you want to relax or if you want to keep it within reasonable hours or reasonable amount of workload. And that is really interesting, I think. So is that something that you see a lot too, the struggle or the pushback?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think almost every day, if not with every client, specifically those of us with perfectionism and things like that to consider, it's in our thinking. It's in our lifestyle. So oftentimes I'll have a client kind of create an inventory list of their belief systems. So when you rest, what does that mean? So if I rest, then I'm lazy. If I take a break, then I'm not doing enough, or I feel unequipped or inadequate. So kind of paying attention to like, what do you correlate with rest? Right? There's rest and there's the ability to relax and restore. And I think all of those have different levels to it. But most of us, we have an unhealthy relationship with rest and restlessness, right? So if I gave you a significant amount of time to just rest and just be, a lot of us find it really difficult to sit in that space. And we almost need permission. As you were saying earlier, it's like we have to over justify and over explain. And, it's really sad, that that's the culture and that's the social norm. So I try to trailblaze through that and help women unlearn that while also being practical and realistic. That sometimes, again, we are outnumbered with demands and responsibilities. We have families, jobs, relationships, and, we're one person, but that's the point. We're a human, we're a person, right? And we're not robots. So we can't operate in this robotic system. And if it was working, we wouldn't be talking about it. If it was working, we wouldn't be in therapy for burnout. We wouldn't be calling our support systems and going, oh, I feel like I'm not doing enough. So when those kinds of internal expectations or external expectations, I think, are placed on someone, it takes a great deal of intentional disruption to unlearn that. And then the application is a whole nother ball game, right? Really putting it into practice is difficult. I think a lot of guilt comes into play once we start to kind of create parameters. And Maybe recognizing too that like guilt isn't a signal that we're doing anything wrong if we're taking a
Mm.
step back or resting. It's just a signal that we're concerned and that we care.
Yes, I love that very much because guilt is a big thing. Guilt and shame, I feel, is something that, at least within my workspace, is coming up a lot in various
Absolutely.
different areas. But it's like often this, like, oh, I'm not doing it right, or I'm not good enough, or I'm doing something wrong, or that's not how I should have done it. So there's a lot of like beating up ourselves in some way or the other. And when you just talked, I thought about like the high achiever or this like perfectionist that you mentioned. I can imagine that people who like come to you or who really experience the burnout and the pressure in such a hard way that they cannot deal with it alone or they feel they need support. I imagine that being a lot of women who fall in the category of high achieving and of really like pushing themselves very much over the edge from intrinsic motivation, not so much from like your boss is telling you you need to stay 2 hours longer every day, but like it's coming from the inside for whatever reasons. But I can imagine that there's a certain kind of personality structure in place that is like more often falling into that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think more times than not, you'll see that a person with high anxiety or a lot of rigidity in their thinking are type A women typically show a lot of symptoms of anxiety, panic disorders, OCD. I think the intersection between overachieving, OCD related disorders or tendencies have a really high correlation. Yeah, I would definitely say those of us that have a lot of all or nothing thinking seem to be very black and white in the way we look at life. And again, right, even if that's who we are at the core, I think it's about figuring out how to accommodate your personality in a way where you don't exploit yourself. So if my personality type is I'm a bit more structured, I'm a bit more like I respond positively to certainty. I like order. I'm thorough. I'm detail oriented. Those are a lot of the characteristics that I see in a lot of my clients who are overachieving. But then there's also some pieces that you may not think of, like hypersensitivity to rejection, fear of disappointment, fear of uncertainty. And so when you have all of those hidden fears, a lot of times it presents as a perfectionistic person, an
Mhm.
overachieving person. And while it looks like they have these great qualities that create this achievement and they're really intrinsically motivated, they're also extremely frightened, extremely anxious. And while they are functioning well, they really aren't. They're just performing well. And
Mhm.
so, my job is to be able to tease apart the difference when a lot of that is really just masking through performance.
Yes. That's a point where I can really say I see myself very seen in that because almost everyone I know is who is kind of falling into that field. We haven't realized that for the longest time where it comes from. So it's like maybe you wanna even work. Maybe you feel good in the moment while you work
Mhm.
to exhaustion, or you like take on another job and like put the pressure on yourself. But the realization that is behind that is fear of rejection, for example, or this like anxiety or feeling of not being safe in whatever form it comes. For me, it took quite a while to like really come to
Yeah.
that kind of conclusion for myself. And I think it's amazing if people search for support and get that a bit faster because you can do something about it. And I feel that's something that is often like there is kind of this feeling of, oh, well, I have nothing to do against that. So maybe I can leave for a few weeks to recover from that burnout, but then I have to go back. So there's this hopelessness instead of, if you look at it from the inner core wound, then you can heal it and you can find another way of caring of yourself in work, and you don't have to like just go back into the situation and endure it. That's at least like the approach that I took, and I think it's working really well to just not go back into a situation that you already know has made you sick once without changing in the inside.
Right, right. I mean, I think that brings up a good point, right? Like in therapy, for example, we start from childhood and we're looking at all of these tri-directional relationships between the way you think and believe and feel. Obviously, we're like a walking triangle, if you will, and we're trying to pinpoint how did this cycle of behavior, how did this cycle of thinking or fear, whatever it is, how did it begin, right? Looking at the origin. So to your point, I think getting to the underlying causes, most of these behaviors are a response, right? And so looking at what is the root cause here, and I think that that makes the process a bit easier, a little bit more digestible when it comes to authentic healing versus let me just kind of cope very quickly and suppress this or take the retreat. To your point, right? Going right back into that cycle, you're less likely to do that. I think if you recognize the origin, and it's not about blaming or it's good or it's bad. It's just I'm observing my behaviors, I'm observing my cycles, and I'm examining the outcome. Most times, thoughts are really hard to unlearn and will take years of practice, right? Behaviors are the same, incredibly embedded tendencies that are hard to unlearn but can be done. And feelings, goodness, that's really hard to control. So I tell people, look at the outcome. How's this working for you? And if you aren't happy with the outcome, you're going to have a lot more buy-in to just keep planting the seed of unlearning.
Yes. The unlearning is something that came up a few times, and I would love to touch on it because it's a topic that's very dear to me. The deconditioning process is, I think, like very, very important, especially in the collective state we are right now. There's a lot to unlearn as women, especially, but for all of us, there's the way we have been printed, programmed, raised, however you want to call it, is most times a way that we had to suppress or change parts of ourselves. This like unlearning that you mentioned, the way to kind of come back to our own soul and really look at, okay, who am I? What am I here for? And how can I care for myself? I feel with it comes a lot of self-love, or maybe before self-acceptance, because all these symptoms we talked about have for me the underlying frequency of I'm not caring for myself. Maybe I don't like myself, or I'm not really in alignment with the whole who I am. And therefore I mask myself, or I put myself in molds easily, or I try to like please others because I'm like, by pleasing others, you normally reject yourself. So there's some kind of like dissonance between you and you that, if healed, will change the way you behave, you think, you feel. And I totally agree on what you said. It's really hard to change beliefs. It's really hard to change thought patterns. There's so much subconscious going on that we don't even realize. So even if you're like consciously trying to do everything right, there's still a really big amount of subconscious stuff going on. And it takes a lot of time and practice and holding yourself accountable or be held accountable. So maybe it's not the quick fix that we all are looking for. Still, it's very doable if you have a big why, if you have support. And yeah, I would love to know how you work with your clients in terms of their environment. Because even if you, as the person who is exhausted, who feels burnout, who's like really needing support, even if you have grasped that and you accept that and you're willing to go in a different direction, there's maybe your family, there's your work environment. Like, how do you support them and communicating that in a way that they can hold firm with their beliefs, with their new ways of, working through that? I'm imagining like an alcoholic who tried to stay sober and everyone says, do you want to drink? And at some point it's really hard to say no. And I think it's like similar in the work environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think no matter what it is that you're trying to unlearn, whether it's a cognitive belief or distortion or behavior, I think we as a collective, so my client and I, we have to make a pinky promise with each other, if you will, around radical acceptance and radical disruption. We're going to be disrupting systems that have been in place for a long time in our lives. We're going to be disrupting relationships that have been cohesed by certain thoughts, beliefs, and just dynamics. And so there has to be this agreed willingness, if you will, not a lot. I mean, you can have just a sprinkle. It's my job to kind of help ground the person, keep a sprinkle of hope. But we have to choose radical acceptance that there's going to be a lot of grief in the unlearning. So that then becomes not only an expectation and an experience we need to prepare for, but we have to just consciously go forward knowing you're going to have to grieve people, places, and spaces that no longer serve you. So we cover questions like, what kind of life do you want to live? And are the environments, the behaviors, the attitudes, and the habits, are they all in alignment with that life that you have visualized and shared with me? And if the answer is no, we have to be a little cut and dry about some things, because there is a sense of sacrifice that we're going to have to make when it comes to unlearning. And we can't carry everything in our past with us during that process. So it's challenging and it's not linear. It's not a staircase. So I really try to be practical and realistic when we begin the process. What is it that you want to unlearn? Sometimes they need a little bit more help even identifying the distortions or the harmful beliefs, right? It's not as clear. Like you said, we've just unconsciously been living this way for so long. It's like, what do you mean there's a problem with the way that I'm thinking and performing? I'm doing well.
Yes.
But that is typically not the case if we are sacrificing and compromising our wellness, which is usually when people find themselves in session with me. So I think, long story short, there has to be a willingness. There's going to have to be a very intentional disruption in the way that you've been living, and radical acceptance that you might lose important relationships or environments that you were once really connected with. And that doesn't mean you won't feel guilt or sadness or grief. More than likely, those will be at the forefront of the process, but it's accepting and using that as information, not a threat that you are doing something wrong or going off track.
Yeah, I think it's really important to be reminded again and again and again that even though there is pushback and that there is guilt coming up or doubt if you're on the right path, that doesn't mean that you're not. So I feel
Right.
if resistance is coming up in any sort of form, then we people have the tendency to shy away from that and run into the other direction. Yeah. But it's not always the best choice to do so. Because what you said, this unlearning takes time and commitment and the acceptance that things change. I always tell my clients that it's kind of like peeling off layers. And by doing so, things will fall apart to some certain extent. But what is behind that, what is underneath that, there's a lot of beauty to be discovered. Yeah, there's things that will be lost or changed, or maybe for a short period of time, there is more tension with the environment you have been so close before. But that doesn't mean that it stays like this, and it doesn't mean that nothing good will come out of it. It's just in that moment, it's uncomfortable. But I feel that's often a thing that holds us back from change in whatever area of our lives. Is this not only I need to change, but also there will be maybe discussions or fights or not being understood by the people in my environment when I do make a change, when I'm not the same person as I was yesterday when I went
But why it's going to be so important, right? When you embark on the journey, whatever that is, that you identify your safe corners. I always say life is kind of like a square. And while there's a lot happening in the nucleus in the center, you need to have at least 4 safe corners, whether those people, environments, habits, self-help resources, therapists, whatever it is. But, and we're not all, I guess, lucky enough to have 4. Ideally, right? Places that you can turn to, people that you can cling to in moments where you feel like you are disappointing those that are, I think, more accustomed to who you were and the life that you were living prior, just to kind of help with the perceived disappointment, rejection, doubt, things of that nature. Yeah. And preparing for that as well, that there will be regression, and there will be moments where it's much easier to take a step back than to pivot forward to that unknown territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's also about forgiving ourselves for maybe having neglected ourselves for so long, or the needs that we had emotionally or physically when we finally embark on a journey of healing, of growing into a healthier version of ourselves. So there is a lot of emotional ups and downs. by going
Yeah.
through any process of change and like really being kind of okay with everything that we've done, or even able to forgive ourselves for how we have treated ourselves, maybe for quite a long time, is really important. So yes, and I love the picture of the with the four corners. And yeah, maybe even if we don't have the luck to have four of them, at least knowing the ones you have, I imagine, is like really giving yourself something to hold on to, or a peace of mind to say like, okay, that's where I can go in those moments where it feels really hard, and like kind of my coworkers are not understanding me, or my family is like kind of not understanding why I'm suddenly not doing all the time, but like maybe trying to rest and recover and do things that are not normal compared to before, that I have this place where I can go, or have this maybe even habit. You mentioned habits. I think that's really interesting to go, like kind of leaning back on ourselves. That's really beautiful.
Yeah. I think the reality is sometimes I'm working with people who don't have a sense of support. They have no anchoring outside of themselves in our 50 minutes, and they're expected to do life for the remainder of that time. So learning to anchor within yourself, yeah, definitely. And being open and receptive to rebuilding those corners as well. There has to be a level of openness. I think as you embark on any journey, there, eventually you'll plant some seeds. You'll have new community. You'll have new resources. But in the time being, I think it's really challenging to have buy-in that that's going to happen on the other side of so much discomfort and change.
Yeah, this like finding the trust in when it's dark is a thing that is like when you have had that once, I think you can really draw from that experience and that inner courage that you have. But like if you don't have someone who's supporting you in that moment, really going through a process like that and sticking to the belief and the trust that things will be better at the end of it, or there will be new safe places, new people to lean on, new connections that can support you, that takes really a lot of inner strength. And I imagine that by the time people come to you, maybe they don't have a lot of that inner strength. So it's about balance to rebuild it at the same time
Yeah.
while you really need it. Yeah.
Yeah. I might be the only variable. I have this saying that helps me ground myself. Whenever you're working with other humans, it's natural for us as providers to also, I think, have questioning and doubt. And, we're measuring humans, and that's a very complex process. But I'm a firm believer that, anything that crumbles can be rebuilt. And so oftentimes, by the time they come to me, they have crumbled to some capacity. Now we're in a space where I think the culture allows for people to come more of as a preventative now for therapy. So maybe I feel myself crumbling, maybe I feel problems brewing. And so we can kind of catch it a little sooner than later. But definitely there are times where therapy is the only anchoring. And so I remind myself, like my personal mantra is, some days I'm just a variable, and some days I am the variable. And so it just really depends on that person's narrative and who else they have. And unfortunately, a lot of times it may not be anyone but our dynamic. So then it becomes learning how to trust. They have to learn how to trust themselves and their skill set, trusting the process as well. And so luckily we also have groups and things like that where I'm able to kind of have an already established community for clients to join. And again, it takes a lot of trust and openness and vulnerability, but it's all about just, I think, stay mindful. We're social people. We're not meant to be alone. And at some point, we need to open our hearts and our bodies to connecting with others.
Yeah, which can give you so much support if you have someone who has maybe gone through a similar process, or who is open to listen to you, can give you so much. Not that you kind of share all the pain in the world with someone, but sometimes I feel like we are seeing so much in others that we cannot see in ourselves. So the moment you have that group, and how amazing that there is a possibility to already join a group of like-minded souls. When people come to work with you, I imagine that gives them a lot. And it really made me sad when he said that so many of your clients like maybe don't have that many safe corners. So maybe the only option, the only way they can express themselves outside of your sessions is a group like this. with new people. So there's a lot of change that is happening at once, and a lot of like unsafety that
Yeah.
with this process of like opening up, of changing, which makes me really bow for the courage that people have, or the level of exhaustion they work themselves in until they're like
Mhm.
finally ready to change something,
Yeah.
not stay where they are.
Yeah. I always say, we're either going to pull from the negatives as far as being brave and vulnerable and open, or we're going to pull from desperation.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times we will try something and take the leap when we're desperate enough as humans, and that's okay. I say, come to me whether you're willing or desperate. Either way, you're going to plant a seed, and it's okay to do it untrusting. It's okay to do it with a ton of social anxiety. It's okay to do it with lack of buy-in. But that's where I think for me it's so important that in our therapeutic relationship that we establish trust and enough rapport first. Yes. So timing is really important. You're not just kind of throwing a ton of suggestions and resources, but really letting them kind of establish a decent amount of readiness. And then us collaborating, right, on like what is safety going to look like when you enter this space. Group can be very vulnerable, but also very triggering. There's an unpredictable component to it, but I think when it's done correctly and it's done with the gradual exposure of the idea, it can be really soothing and validating just to have so many like-minded people. And so my favorite thing in group is when people are like, wow, I really heard myself and so tonight. Or when we follow up with our individual sessions, they're like, wow, I had no idea that so-and-so is so different from me, but that we live so many similar experiences. And so the beauty is that, like you said, we don't have to overshare in order to connect either. And everyone has the autonomy to kind of feel and give and take as they see fit.
Mm-hmm. But I feel like there's a lot of strength and trust that we can draw from even observing how others live their life. Kind of what I wanted to do with the podcast as well, is to like give people inspiration on what we can do in moments when we feel like it's really dark or we feel like really challenged, because often there is so much motivation inside of us that can be felt when we listen to other people's stories or other people's way finding themselves out of a certain situation. And then there's this spark of like, oh, I can do that too. Or, oh, maybe I have even done that once, so I can do it again. And there's strength coming through seeing other people go through their life challenges as well. And yeah, even if there's not like the biggest connection from an obvious perspective, there can be a lot of like underlying things that match that can help people. I think it's really beautiful that the universe is built that way, that we can support each other without like even knowing it.
Yeah.
That it can be a big anchor as well.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. I mean, even in our dynamic, right? We're on opposite sides of the globe. As we were kind of chatting a bit beforehand, there was an instant, sincere connection, right? Around just lived experiences. So, again, you just have to be open and we have to be mindful not to judge and pre-assume and just kind of enter a space. And, I really challenge us to just be authentic and to be sincere in a world where it's so easy to just conform and mask. And there's so much pressure inflated around being and speaking and looking a certain way. So yeah, I'm grateful for the space for us to just be able to normalize a lot of the experiences in a way where not everything's so like clinically problematic.
Mhm.
Some of these are just normal human experiences that we should be speaking more about.
Yes, and like you said, it doesn't have to be that dramatic before it's time to look at it or start something, or the prevention aspect essentially that to my mind comes like the way ancient Eastern medicine is doing it. They're going to the doctor before they're even having a hint of sickness. And I think that's really lovely compared to the system that I've known that is like the classical system in the US as well. I know. So coming back to that space of caring for ourselves before the dramatic things happen is really a big unlearning. And then what you said fits into that too for me is like having the openness and having the wanting to not judge are two also very big unlearnings, I feel, that are so good if we do them for ourselves on an individual level for our healing journey, but also as a collective. Like imagining a world where we would not judge, where we have maybe not raised with that much of judgment and that much of like closeness and, oh, you need to protect yourself and, oh, that person. And, there's so much like little things that we pick up on our journey from children to adults of like, be aware, be mindful. The world is kind of dangerous, and you need to shield yourself in any way possible. So the contradiction to openness, basically, and therefore we learn to judge. And I think if we can like unlearn even the tiniest bit of those two, and be really open and go open into a conversation, and like really say, okay, what can I learn from you? There is so much wisdom in the world, and there is so much to be revealed, and so much inspiration and motivation and trust to be found from people you might have never spoken to, like we just now do. We could have like sat there like this and like, what is that? I don't know. What should I talk about? But there are always like so many options to go, and I think the more we are open and kind of not trying to control what happens, that's when miracles can come in.
Yeah, absolutely. Always say we have to surrender.
Yeah.
Surrender to life. We have to surrender to the uncertainty. Life is just an evolving door. And I think when we surrender to that process, instead of making it such a staircase approach, right? To know the exact next step in order to move or pivot.
Yes.
I'm guilty for sure. But I think, again, unlearning, choosing to surrender, and choosing to be a light, right? Creating a portal within ourselves so that other people feel safe.
Yeah.
Engaging in that type of freedom and unlearning. I think working with people who typically not only have these psychological disorders, but also are on the receiving end of traumatic events, it's really, really challenging to instill hope and to instill trust when your lived experiences really don't provide a lot of evidence that the world is a safe place. So you have to keep living through corrective experiences to unlearn a lot of these things. We're not just going to wake up and have a quick light switch approach to the way we think. We really have to keep living and somewhat balance out those traumatic events or those poor experiences with new ones. So we can't sit still in it. We really do have to kind of find the strength to put one foot in front of the other. Finding that sense of resilience is just really a huge stepping stone in the work that we do.
Yes, I agree. And what you just said, the word control popped in my mind, because I feel like, especially if you find yourself in a burnout situation, or in a situation where you've taken on a lot more than you can handle, there's probably a lot of like want to control in there. And so the trusting in a situation that you have no idea how it turns out, and you don't have the next 5 steps, is really a thing to
It's
really say, okay, I have no idea. Because like in hindsight, everything always makes sense. But if you stand there and say, I have no idea what I do tomorrow, how I operate, how I navigate my life within the next hours, because there's no roadmap for that, that takes a decent amount of trust in yourself, or whatever higher power you might believe in, courage to do so, and to like really go into that unlearning phase and say, like, even though my life is not providing enough experiences to say like I can trust myself, or things will turn out in a better way, I'm willing to try again. So again, this openness is really a big thing. And I feel for that is exactly this, like holding space and being open and non-judgmental, so that people can see like there's another way of talking to ourselves, of like having a connection with ourselves. There's so much you mirror back to people, even without saying, that they can take on for their own private moments where they're alone with themselves.
Yeah. And accepting it, it's an ongoing assignment. I think sometimes I have to really pop the distorted bubble in therapy of like fixing and coping and we're going to heal with a period. And it's really such an ongoing process. It will evolve and yes, look different as you further develop in your thinking and your emotional intelligence. Yes, but it never ends. It really doesn't. And there isn't a finish line. And while that can feel and sound really exhausting, I think you have to center yourself in trusting that your skill set will develop. Therefore, your hope will develop and your buy-in and your resilience can be strengthened. And kind of to your point, right? If we circle back to like control, it made me think about how like sometimes with clients, we break down like, what is your relationship with control? And so while people know I respond well to control, I respond well to structure and certainty, the real concern is how do you respond when all of that is taken away from you? As long as you have that in your environment and you are embedded in that, you're seemingly safe and fine. Most times when people have found themselves with me, their anxiety is at an all-time high because there's a disruption in that safety. And so really helping us to, I think, look at it more of like a biological, neurological way of like the brain is always going to prioritize safety. It will reason and logic later. For now, in the moment of perceived threat or real threat, it's just going to kind of survive the threat, right? Or try to protect. And a lot of that is done through control. So I think, we have to really think about control as a protective defense mechanism, yes, but it's not as anchoring as we think it is. And if it was a real concept that we could control everything, we just would be, right? If it was easy, we'd all be doing it. So really figuring out less of like, why do I seek control and more of like, how do I respond when that's disrupted? And when and where did my brain learn that really makes me feel safe? That really brings me a sense of security. And how can I pursue that, but still in a way that doesn't, again, exploit me or destroy my wellness in the process?
Yes. It's really interesting the way you just described it. It made me think of like this control, which is such a big thing in many people's lives. And many of my clients know that and are really self-conscious about their like relationship to control, I'd say. But from your description, I would say it's the surface level thing that we kind of touch on first, but below that is maybe like the real issue or the thing that really makes you nervous is if this predictability falls away, who are you then? How are you going to operate? So this, again, perceived threat of what am I doing if I don't have this clear structure? I need maybe more flexibility or more openness or whatever, but it's not so much about the control then anymore. The control is just like the way we kind of try to things, but it's not the real issue. And I think even that awareness can do a lot to you if you are willing to witness yourself day to day. Be like, okay, where is that showing up? Maybe even where have I started picking that up, or where does it come from to like grasp it? But below that, the levels of, again, rejection is popping up, or this like feeling unsafe when things are not working out the way that I imagined or planned them. That's a real interesting thing. And to your point of how we navigate this trust moment, I feel like this learning that we have, that I totally agree is always continuing. So it's not like, oh, I healed, I learned, everything's now fine, I've mastered it, but it's like a constant learning. I feel a big shift is when people realize that this doesn't have to be a draining work. Maybe at first it is, until you like got out of the roughest parts, or until you kind of learned how the change is happening. But it can be, you can look at it from curiosity as well. So it doesn't have to be like, oh my God, I will never finish this until I die, like really exhausting kind of way of looking at it. But there can be a lot of like curiosity about learning, about discovering yourself. So I do work a lot with perspective shifts. And I think it's really nice that you can shift everything into a version where it looks completely different. So even that I've never healed can be something that excites you, because like, okay, what is the next thing that I can discover about myself, or how can I make it even better? How can I make my life better? And then things maybe are not that draining, but there kind of is a lightness coming to them.
Right, right. I think even that kind of shifting, right? You have to look at it like that's the beauty and the complexity of being human is we have these choices and you can choose to change the lens. I always say, like reframing and shifting your perspective, it's not miracle work, right? It takes a lot of repetition, a lot of drilling, and your buy-in will fluctuate. Your faith and your belief in what it is you're trying to unlearn and relearn will fluctuate, especially in seasons of heightened stress and anxiety and things of that nature. But it's learning not to listen to the lie that anxiety will typically tell you, which is not only is this perceived or real threat dangerous, but it's unrecoverable, it's unrepairable, and you're going to be super unequipped, which is not true. So I think even in moments of adversity, being able to go, okay, things are not fine right now. And although I'm not sure what the next step looks like, I can trust my skill set. I can anchor in this belief that I can pivot, I can problem solve, I can use these resources, and I can choose to look at this, like you said, right, with that curiosity. So learning that like our emotions, they're sensations, they're pieces of information. They're not threats. They're not anything that we need to panic or become really catastrophic about. It's just going, what is this telling me? What can I gather from this? Kind of looking at ourselves like data.
Yes, yes, I feel like the emotions are a real threat often because they're unpredictable and there's maybe
Mhm.
control if you really let your
Yeah.
emotions flow. So the moment we kind of a bit separate ourselves from the emotions we feel, I love seeing emotions as kind of your GPS system, to
Mhm.
how you can navigate your life or how close you are to your alignment or however you want to call it. If you see them as something that is supporting you instead of something that is threatening you, I agree, it's a big change to like really see your life from a different lens and take on that more empowered or curious standpoint instead of staying in the victim mode that is so easy to fall for. But it is
Right.
not like really doing anything good to ourselves because then we are again at the guilt and shame thing that we started with. So it comes back full circle, but we're not like kind of evolving out of it if we stay in that life's
Right.
happening to me thinking.
Yeah. Well, yeah, self-deprecation is definitely a pain point that we target, or at least that I find myself working with. And it's natural. It's not anything to then shame ourselves about. But I think there does have to be a willingness to receive that that is indeed what's happening and that you can choose to change that as well. And so a lot of times we really do have to sit with the hard question of how am I contributing to my problem? How is my thinking contributing or maintaining my symptoms or my concerns? And figuring out the slippery slope of, I think, ownership and accountability versus blame. So ownership doesn't have to be self-blaming, and figuring out the language that you need to distinguish the two. So a lot of times that's really what we do in session, right? Is we're helping, I think, other humans define the language and then figuring out, like in real day to day form, what does that look like and feel like? What's that going to sound like internally? What does that look like in your behaviors, especially so that we don't avoid that regression in the same cycle or self sabotage without consciously knowing that that's the direction we're headed in.
Yes, that's really powerful, and I think like all these little things, it was what makes it really heavy over time. If people can become more aware about these like mental chatters or the way they put themselves down, or when we fall into victim mode back, or when there is this guilt and shame coming up that we might have as a habit since early childhood, just
Yeah.
noticing it and having this like, oh, okay, we talked about that. That's like when it's coming up, that is like a big shift. I know it sounds so cheesy to say like awareness is the first step, but it really is like the starting point for any change before we go into the nitty-gritty work of changing it. Really, you need to like kind of see what you want to change and have, if you have a blueprint because you've already talked about the things, then it's much easier, isn't it, to find that other way of reacting that you haven't had present before because you were just in survival mode, or just like your subconscious was running the show and you had no idea how to access even that wisdom of, oh, I could, instead of being angry and shouting, I could also, whatever, calm down, take a breath, put some cold water on my face, or whatever it is to like kind of disrupt the system. But if you have practiced that, things can change a lot. So it's kind of like a visualization for in a spoken form.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, I think that's the beauty of therapy too, is that you can use writing, you can use visual aids. Sometimes we whip out a whiteboard and it's like, okay, show me exactly what that looks like. It could be a timeline. There's so many ways to kind of get that blueprint. And so, I'm a strong believer that I never want to step ahead of someone's process of self-awareness, right? My job is to ask the right questions and to allow someone to be introspective while just facilitating the space, right? Rather than going, hey, I think when you do X, Y, and Z, it leads to this and that. Like, I don't want to connect the dots for the women that I'm working with, right? So I think to your point, self-awareness, it can be really straightforward, and sometimes it can be really rocky and emotional as you are figuring out these blind spots and creating awareness around really uncomfortable truths. It's definitely the first step. Whether it's cheesy or not, it's still the truth. And, it's just the application, I always say, is the hardest part, right? So now I know what I know, but now what?
Mm-hmm.
Where do I go from here? And so a lot of times, at least in the work that I'm doing, because most of my clients are pretty high functioning and pretty self-aware, I'm not really sharing any profound new pieces of information. It's usually more of a dissection and then connecting those dots and figuring out more of an actionable plan. I like for my clients to leave feeling like they've got something tangible to work with. And that means trying on different things. But you said something that I wanted to touch on, which was like, when we're surviving and just kind of getting through. And so really recognizing when we're surviving versus coping, right? I think there are a lot of times in our lives where maybe the trauma's over or the heightened stress is over and we're still in survival mode. We're still responding in stress responses rather than feeling and labeling and processing and coping. And there's a huge difference that only the nervous system usually can kind of create awareness around. I'm always curious for you, how do you gently share with the women that you're working with, hey, I think you might be surviving a storm that isn't really present anymore.
Yeah, it's I love that you brought that up, because I feel it's a big thing that we often are so caught up in our traumas, and it's like I'm believing that the body cannot differentiate between like the real event and you reliving it in your mind maybe every day because it's still so present. So it's a tricky thing, and I'm doing it the same way you do it. I'm normally not pointing out the obvious things, but I try to kind of navigate my women to realizing it themselves. Because I've learned from my own experience and also through my work, the moment we kind of force on change or force on an insight, it's just not working, or it's only working for a short time, or there's a lot of resistance. And what I'm really interested in is creating our life from the inside out. So I'm never gonna push something from the outside onto a client I'm working with. For me, it's more like I do a lot of like relaxation work before we even start, because I found that if the nervous system is kind of relaxed and we're feeling really safe and there is an intention set and there is a clarity that there's no judgment in here, and that nothing of course leaves the room, but there's also nothing in the room that is making you smaller than you need to be, and there is this safety created, then things up much more naturally. And sometimes it's amazingly easy to guide my clients to the point where they see like, oh, okay, well, maybe that's not actually a thing anymore, or maybe I'm kind of stuck in a loop that I don't need to, or that it's not serving me anymore. So the way back to alignment is easier if everything is set. And so that's like always the first step that I'm working with. And then we do a lot of like subconscious work and things come up normally really easy the moment people are open. If someone is not open, of course, then it's kind of like a really hard process. But I'm luckily like having the gift to be a space where people open up quite easily. So that's
Yeah.
really a good thing. And I'm really grateful for the vulnerability that comes with it, because it's often, I had one client who said, that's really in my head since a long time, who said like, I wasn't able to admit that in front of myself. And I think that's something that we often kind of forget, that yes, admitting our problems and challenges or whatever we think we fall short in front of others is really a big thing and takes really courage, but often we're not even admitting it in front of ourselves. And I think that was really a profound moment when that client said that to me, because I realized like how much we're kind of suppressing in front of our own awareness. If that can come up in a coaching session, that's like the biggest gift I think people can give themselves, to like be honest with themselves about what they're thinking or how they're operating. And then from there, things can change. So
Right. Right.
going from the logic to the body beliefs or the subconscious work is really, really big thing.
Yeah. That's beautiful. And I'm sure quite rewarding to be on the other side of that and just holding space for someone
Yeah.
going through such a vulnerable process.
Yeah.
And we were talking about how important it is for us to do our work as well, right? Internally, to make sure that we are a safe portal
Yes.
for other people as we invite them to do such vulnerable and sensitive work. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And also like I don't know how you feel, but I sometimes it's called supervision. I don't like that term very much, but I feel like if you're some kind of supporting other people, however you do it, you need a space to let go of the things that you have a hard time letting go of. Maybe a really hard story, or really someone who's kind of resonating on a much deeper level than someone else, and you're really taking that on with you. You need someone to process that with, or to help you letting go of the stuff that you've accumulated. So that's, I think, very necessary, and also kind of part of the integrity of the work for me, to say like, if I say I'm doing coaching with you, then I kind of need to do coaching for myself too, because otherwise it's just not fitting together. So
Yeah. I mean, I think that's so important. Like to your point, right? I think the ethical um to do is to um do your own work to make sure that you are not just holding a space, but being a safe space, truly. And I would say that in our training, especially formal therapy, there's a lot of being taught. You leave everything internal at the door, and there's very limited self disclosure around any hardships. We are trained that you have to be extremely congruent, right, in order to make space for those who are not congruent. But the reality is, we're humans that hold a lot of space. Our bodies are keeping score in a very in-depth way. So yeah, absolutely having mentorships or supervisors and things like that. And just, I think, being humble enough to know when it's time to have extra support or to take breaks or scale down your caseload or whatever it might be. And, it's just, it's an ongoing kind of sense of evaluation, right? That you have to stay mindful. Where's my capacity? My willingness to be a clinician for my clients is always there, but being mindful of my own threshold, my own inventory, and definitely doing the work to stay afloat. Yeah.
that's really beautiful. I love how you put it. I thank you so much.
Yeah.
I feel it's very important for ourselves to kind of protect ourselves, but also people feel it if you are caring for yourself as someone who wants to care for others. So that's like a real coming full circle thing. That is really, I love that from the energy. So
Way really honest about it.
yeah.
All of my clients, I think naturally, right? Like we're in an interesting relationship dynamic where they do a ton of disclosing and a lot of processing these really intimate details of their lives. And, while we are working towards a relationship and a safe one at that, there is a lot of limited information that they have on me.
Yeah, true.
So I think where it's appropriate and ethical and relatable, I'm always transparent. I'm a client as well. I have a therapist, I have mentors, I have people in my life that hold me when I'm weak. And so I think, I'm in a space now with having a private practice where I can openly share that. And I can be vulnerable about, hey, this week was heavy for me as well. Here's what I did in order to make sure that I was able to have the capacity and show up in the way that I need to.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's a lot of vulnerability in that and a lot of humanizing in that when we are expected, I think, as coaches or therapists to always have it together and have done all the work, to have every answer. And that can be further from the truth. So I think really moving in that type of humility has really freed me of imposter syndrome and just the weight of it all.
Yes, I love that you touched on that. I think it's for you, it's a wonderful, or for us as coaches, healers, or whatever, where you are supporting others, it's such a beautiful gift to be open as well, because it's kind of like it's a restricted flow of vulnerable information to one point and then not back. So that's kind of always giving some sort of imbalance that doesn't have to be bad, but at some point I think we feel it. And for us, it's often maybe hard to even stay that really neutral or not let out any information about ourselves. So of course, when it's appropriate, and of course, like really asking yourself why and what you share, but sharing with others is necessary. And I feel as a client, from the client side, I am always very appreciative when my mentors, my coaches share with me about their life too, because it builds such a different way, such a different form of trust and relationship, and I can open so much more. So there's benefit for both sides. It has to be done very mindfully, of course,
Right.
but it's beautiful, and I think it's part of like making it human again and not so much professional. Sometimes it's not even the professionality that is needed. And I really deeply believe that everyone, if they're having a degree or an education, kind of like helping people or not, can support others. So I'm remembered of another woman I've worked with who said, like, there must be a way for someone without a psychological degree to support others. And I was like, yes, of course. And I think like kind of bringing that back to, even if you have a degree, if you have like a classical education, this doesn't mean that you cannot use your like normal human behavior in it. It doesn't have to be separate, and kind of like bringing those together where it fits is not only necessary, but it's also very beneficial to both parts. If you can do it, of course, like maybe as an employee, when it's forbidden by whatever contract you signed, you can't. But if you can, feel it's really bringing another layer of trust and inspiration to the whole relationship between a client and a coach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was the most exciting and rewarding piece through private practice, was just kind of getting to have a really firm grip on that type of autonomy. Of course, keeping ethics in mind and making sure that the therapeutic alliance is what it is expected to be, but getting to blend that innate gift and that skill set together. Like we were saying, I don't think there's any amount of clinical background that could have prepared me for some of these moments with other humans outside of experience, and just gaining wisdom over time and using my humanness to connect with other humans. The statistics show that 50% of therapeutic best outcomes are really a result of the relationship, the empathy, and the positive regard. So while I have specialized in anxiety and panic disorders and have done a ton of continued education to stay sharp and crisp with the data and the stats, there's still this piece that's all about just instilling connection and sincerity and I just believe strongly, right, that will always kind of outweigh. So it's just so important, I think, when you're looking for providers, coaches, therapists in any capacity, that yes, you're looking for a high level of skill and it is important, but making sure that you just feel seen and valued and heard by the person that is holding the space for you. Because that's going to be the cohesion when your buy-in on the modals die down, when your buy-in on the treatment plans aren't really there, when you're tired of the process. It'll be the cohesion of that relationship that, in my case, typically keeps the client engaged in the process.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. It's always coming back to a like soul to soul relationship to some point.
Yeah.
And that's the thing
Yeah.
that really nourishes us and helps us believe and trust in something when the logic is kind of not working at the moment. So I love that you're really mindful about that. And I think it's really necessary that we continue to create a world where that is a big part. And yeah, there's data and there's education and there needs to be like a certain amount of like professional behavior. But then again,
Yeah.
it's human to human and it's also very important. So kind of blending those two together without saying like it needs to be 100% of this or 100% of this, but we kind of the balance between all these pieces of wisdom, because sometimes it's just the wisdom of the heart that is needed and not the wisdom of the logic. And sometimes you need a combination. Most times I feel it's a combination of both. And so
yeah,
we naturally know how to do it if we haven't learned enough of what we have printed with. I think again, like I love that you said it helped you to kind of not fall for imposter syndrome, that you connected with your human, from human to human with your client. And I think that's really beautiful because it kind of keeps us protected as well if we don't go too much into the logic, but really staying open from the heart, from the coach side, not only from the client side.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh my God, I could talk. I'm just seeing it's like 1 hour, 11 minutes, which is really beautiful. And I think we could talk for many more hours, but
no, we'll have to do it again. That just means we'll have to touch on several more topics.
Yes, I would love to. I think there's a certain amount of like, how long can you listen to something?
Right.
That I'm trying to be mindful of, but I wasn't today because this was just, thank you, so soul nourishing and very curious, and thank you for answering all my questions. It was really a very joyful experience, and yes, I would love to like do that again and see what comes up again, because I'm sure there are many more things.
Ever connected, we have all the opportunities, right?
Yes.
The beauty of being open, right, and being like-minded. So
yeah,
I appreciate you so much sharing your space, sharing your platform, and just sharing your time. So we will definitely have to revisit.
we will. Thank you too for your wisdom, your energy, your openness, and all the wonderful information that is so supportive, and I'm sure can help a lot of people just like tune in and help, maybe to help make the decision to say like, okay, I'm kind of searching for someone who can support me wherever it is.
Right.
So yeah, I will link your contacts in the captions below. Is there any favorite way that you would love people to reach out? Is there a favorite or a not so favorite way to contact you?
You know, my email in my bio on Instagram is fine. Even just messages on social media is fine. I'm on Psychology Today if people are looking for more of a directory-based way. No strong preference.
Okay, okay. I'm linking everything below, and then I'm wishing you a wonderful day, and I'm really looking forward to connecting with you again.
We shall. All right, Anna. Have a great day, okay? Talk to you soon.